I've reviewed quite a lot of medical devices. So this is really talking about not only the international markets, but also a lot about the foundations of your device and how you would document it and how you would think about it from more of a regulatory standpoint to make sure you're kind of starting off in the right direction. So we'll talk about a little bit about how the international markets work. We'll talk about ISO 13485 and MDSAP, which are certification programs. And then EU MDR and IVDR, which is how you actually get your device certified so you can sell it. And then we'll talk about intended purpose and clinical benefit, which are really the foundations for how you think about describing your device and getting it clinically approved. And then we'll talk about device classification. We'll look at it from the EU perspective, but it's really the same concepts apply to all markets. So FDA would a similar route, but with just different words. And then we'll just have open Q&A. And really, I like to do presentations more conversational. So if you have questions, just feel free to jump in. So regulatory strategy in international markets. This is really coming from a set of 6 webinars that we did this year. These were free webinars from BSI, really focused on startups. What I'll cover today is kind of covering the first 2 of these webinars, but I think we have also good webinars on how to start your risk management process, how to start planning for your clinical evaluations and collecting clinical evidence that your device does what you think it will do. And then also looking at manufacturing and human factors engineering, which a lot of companies really struggle with. So I think they'll get the slides to this, and they should be able to click the link to register for those webinars. They're on demand, so just go to our website and you can find them. So when we did these webinars, it was from the perspective of engineers from BSI who worked at startups. And what we found talking about this is really starting the documentation process early helps a lot. And I think all of us going through the startup process kind of got to that FDA approval step and then had to create a lot of documentation at the end right before approval. So really we're pushing to start that process as early as possible. And that's really the kind of central thesis of all of these webinars. Also, ISO 13485 is a way that you can demonstrate that you can manufacture or design your device. We'll talk a little bit more about how that works. And then how to establish evidence that your device works both on the benchtop and then from a clinical perspective. And then also looking at, okay, how do you engage with regulators and actually get your approval, which is a skill in itself. All of this is really to try to shorten the timelines and make sure that you're making a good argument to your investors for how you should spend your resources and not get to the end. And I was definitely in the position of getting feedback from the FDA and having to go ask for more money from investors, which isn't a nice thing to have to do. So as much as we can avoid that as possible, that's great. And then, this is kind of just looking at why regulatory strategy matters for startups. So I think it really adds credibility if you can articulate your regulatory strategy to your investor and speak well about how you'll get approval. And I think you can also, with some of these certifications, you can help kind of prove that you're a legitimate company and not what I would call a hobby, which I've been a part of startups that were really more hobbies than real companies. So how do you take that next step and show that you're ready for approval? So ISO 13485, if you look at any real device company, they are 13485 certified. A lot of you might have heard of ISO 9001. This is really the next step where it's a very device-specific certification. It covers usually design of the device. So if I'm reviewing a device that's a vascular device, I would want to know that the people making it have scope to design vascular devices. This is how you can prove that they have that scope. You also get scopes for manufacturing vascular devices or manufacturing hernia mesh. So it's really a very focused medical device certification. It's something BSI offers. I think one of the things I didn't realize when I was at a startup was you can get scope for just design. So, we were going through the startup process and really trying to get full scope for design, manufacturing, distribution years earlier than we really needed it. But if you can get that initial scope for design, which is much less expensive, it takes less time, that really shows credibility to your investors that, an outside entity like BSI or one of the other certification bodies has looked at your quality system and you're a legitimate company. So I think it's a good way to get started. And then, this is also kind of newly recognized by the FDA. So when you go to get your FDA approval, you can use your ISO 13485 to demonstrate that you have a quality system. Any questions on 13485? MDSAP is ISO 13485 on steroids. So it's essentially the same kind of requirements, but it also adds in region-specific or regulator-specific requirements for the US, Brazil, Australia, Canada, and Japan. So by getting an MDSAP certificate, you can avoid a lot of the audits from those regions, which is nice for larger companies, probably not as relevant for a startup. But it's something that, as you're looking at getting certified, you can make a more informed decision that, okay, MDSAP is more of a future thing, ISO 13485 if you're just going to go into the US market initially. So EU MDR and IVDR, these are the regulations in Europe to be able to sell your device, to get it certified. So the MDR is device and IVDR is for in vitro diagnostic devices. I mostly look at MDR, well, actually only look at MDR reviews. We're really looking at safety and performance of the device. Does it perform clinically? You do have to get a submission to an EU notified body to have this done. There's a list of notified bodies. There's probably around 30 at this point. BSI probably has 30% of the certificates, so we're one of the largest notified bodies. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about kind of that process as well. So post Brexit, there is UK specific essentially regulation. At this point, it's kind of collapsing down to if you get an MDR certificate, the UK will recognize it. So it's becoming less of an issue. We're a British company, and we actually moved to the Netherlands because of Brexit. So we're now a Dutch notified body instead of a British notified body, even though we're a royal charter. And I think I work for the King of England, but I'm not sure. Kind of luckily going away, but still something to consider if you're going to European markets. So in terms of like the structure of these certificates, you essentially end up with at least one, maybe multiple MDR certificates, depending on the classification of devices. So your MDR QMS certificate basically shows that you have a quality system that meets MDR requirements. So it's basically ISO 13485 plus some stuff from MDR. And you also have scope to sell groups of devices. And these are kind of your lower classification devices, like more of a catheter that doesn't touch the heart would be a two-way device. So you can sell groups of these types of devices, and it's done more of on a sampling basis. So we would look at files from these devices every year, and you get that certification. When you get into the higher classification devices like 2B or class 3, then you have certificates for each device individually or each product family. And that we're doing more on monitoring them every year for that device specifically. But that's essentially how the structure works. So you're getting either approval for a group or an individual device based on classification. And that's where the classification that we'll talk about becomes important, because if you wrongly classify the device, you may not meet all of the requirements to actually sell the device. Mm. It really becomes an issue more with if you have a medicinal product in your device and don't realize it. This is kind of a busy slide, but might be interesting to some of you to look at later. So kind of trying to marry up where you should be in your regulatory journey versus your funding. So the argument we were trying to make here is if you're at the pre-seed round, you're really at the stage of confirming that your device is appropriately classified, that you have the intended purpose laid out correctly, kind of those pre-regulatory things to make sure you're in the right path. When you start getting funding, that's when you might start looking at ISO certification, especially on the design side. And then preparing technical documentation comes a little bit later when you get more funding, and essentially trying to kind of map out where you are in your regulatory strategy versus your funding. So I think this is something that you could take and kind of build your own pathway to show your investors, look, I've looked at, this is the regulatory strategy, this is where we are with funding, and try to kind of marry those up to make it at least look like you have a good plan for your regulatory rollout. Yeah, and this is just talking about kind of the things that you can do to build your regulatory strategy. So really getting that strong QM quality management system. A lot of people hire consultants to come in and just install an ISO 13485 quality system for them. Pretty readily available because it's such a universal standard that you can find consultants to do that for you. So any questions on kind of like the overall regulatory landscape? It was pretty quick, but you guys are all US based. So I think a lot of that is more geared toward, building a long-term plan. And I think with US based companies, having a plan for MDR certification could increase your valuation, especially long-term. If your target is to get bought by Medtronic or, J&J, they're all in international markets. So if you have an MDR certificate, that's going to boost your valuation, even if you're not planning to sell there. So intended purpose and clinical benefit. This is really where, as reviewers, we find most of the issues, especially in Europe. Most refusals come from.
Sorry. No, I think it just came off.
Yeah. So most of the issues we find are really with clinical, especially in Europe. I would say the clinical requirements right now for Europe are more stringent than the US. There are some regulatory changes that are maybe switching that a little bit, where they may actually be less stringent in a couple of years for some devices. So really the US and EU kind of go back and forth in terms of, what is the easier market to get into initially.
Do you have any one-off examples that you could share on what kind of those differences might look like or have looked like?
Yeah, so a good one and pretty relevant to Memphis. Orthopedic implants went from not very regulated in Europe to hyper-regulated, where everything's on a product certificate and you need a lot of clinical data. Mm-hmm. It's going to potentially switch to a lot of like the fracture plates and kind of the bread and butter ortho devices, would be what we would call well-established technology. And you would not need clinical data for that type of device. So that would be a pretty big swing in terms of how much clinical data you would need for an orthopedic device. I think the same will apply to a lot of devices that are more your standard of care devices, which makes sense that, if it's a fracture plate and we've been using fracture plates for decades, why do you need clinical data for this small variant? So that's really where the regulation is potentially going. It's not going to be approved until maybe a year from now. So really the big issue that we see is very foundational is defining your intended purpose for your device. So it's really, what is your device going to do? The kind of classical example of this is hernia mesh, where hernia mesh is used to bridge soft tissue. What most companies want to do is say that it's intended for everywhere in the body. If you do that, we're going to look for clinical data for it to be able to work everywhere in the body. And if you do that, that's going to cost you a small fortune because you'll need to cover a lot of different indications. So if you were to say the intended purpose is to be a hernia mesh for inguinal repair, that really limits the amount of clinical data you need to collect to get that on the market. Counter argument there is it limits the amount of market that you can sell into. So, defining your intended purpose and your indications for use really both affects your marketing strategy and your clinical strategy. So that's where we think this is kind of one of the most fundamental things that you need to get right early. If you're too aggressive, it can bite you. If you're not aggressive enough, it can bite you. The other thing we see, especially for software devices, AI is kind of the hot trend right now. Devices have to have a clinical benefit to the patient. We see a lot of devices talked about that aren't actually medical devices because they don't have an intended clinical benefit that you can actually articulate, or it's not a clinical benefit that's actually relevant to a patient. One of them that came up pretty recently in my team was an AI system for imaging, and it would increase accuracy by an order of magnitude for some variable. When we have a team of internal clinicians that look at these devices, they said an order of magnitude more accuracy on that does not matter clinically at all. So essentially, they've made a device that has no clinical relevance. So at that point, is it even a medical device? And is your company even a company if you're not a medical device? So that's where, being able to really articulate your clinical benefit and having it meaningful to patients is so key to having a successful company. Any questions on this? So things to consider when creating your intended purpose. Having an actual disease or condition that it's treating. Patient populations are very important, especially for the devices I work on, vascular devices. We get a lot of devices where companies want to put them into pediatric patient populations or aren't labeling against putting them in that population. So if you're not labeling against it, we're going to expect data for pediatric populations. So it might be something where you want to contraindicate or put a warning if you don't have data for a specific patient group. You also need to consider intended users, especially a lot of our in vitro diagnostic devices. They're actually used by the patients themselves. So you need to consider, who's using the device, what part of the body is it touching, duration of use. We'll talk about classification, but that's really important in terms of both the indications, but also how it's classified, because that can bump up your classification. And then, are you using it for repeated applications, precautions? So all of these things, the sooner you can figure these out and really nail this down, the better you'll be. Then this is talking about, how do you define clinical performance? So really it's a direct or indirect medical benefit. We see a lot of accessories where it's actually kind of hard to articulate a clinical benefit. A classic example is for orthopedic implants, the bone reamer that holds out the shape for an acetabular cup. It's not actually a clinical benefit to put a big hole in your bone in and of itself, other than maybe weight savings. But it's giving you the indirect clinical benefit of being able to install that hip implant that has a very direct clinical benefit. So, and it's kind of a silly thing, but when you get to a regulatory submission and you're not articulating that indirect clinical benefit, you'll get questions from your reviewer, and that'll cost you potentially months, which I've seen it actually cost a manufacturer a year for essentially no reason, because they were arguing about the clinical benefit. So just something to think about as you're really defining what your device is and what it will do. Make sure it's relevant to the patient and not AI for AI's sake. So then once you have your clinical benefit and your intended purpose, that really helps you do a state-of-the-art search and be able to find what are competitive devices in this area. Really, without that kind of upfront research or definition of what your intended purpose is and what your device will do, it's hard to get your state-of-the-art objectives. And this really leads to what do we need to prove to show that the device is safe and performs well in a clinical environment. The rest of the webinars kind of go more into how you would do your clinical planning. So I won't get into that today, but you can look at the webinars that are available online to look at how to do a clinical plan. Any questions on any of that before we go into classification?
So when you talk about the positive clinical benefit and how it's defined here, is that compared to just baseline, or do you compare it to gold standard treatment? What are you measuring against there? Or is it case by case?
Yeah, so usually you take your intended purpose and then you do a state-of-the-art search, and you would find your benchmark devices or competitors and define your safety and performance objectives. And then you're trying to find in literature if there are safety and performance objectives spelled out. So trying to think of an example. So like say a hernia mesh. Oh, actually even easier, breast tissue marker. So the only thing it does is you, after you do the biopsy, you inject these tiny markers into the biopsy cavity so that you can find that biopsy space later if you have a positive diagnosis. So really the only thing it needs to do is not migrate from that site and be visible under imaging. So your clinical performance objectives there would be you can see it and it doesn't migrate. Your safety objectives are it doesn't react adversely with the tissue. So given those kind of safety and performance objectives, you can look at your literature and see, okay, for J&J's markers, what are they reporting for migration? What are they reporting for ability to see the marker? And you can kind of make that comparison in literature. That works really well for well-established devices. For more cutting-edge devices, you may have to make a clinical study to actually get that data.
Thanks.
Any other questions on that? Yeah, that's we probably have 20 webinars on that topic because it's the hardest part. Yeah. So device classification. Really, any regulatory scheme is built on classification first. It helps you establish what is the risk level of the device. In Europe, there's class 1, class 2A, 2B with a couple of different flavors, and class 3. Class 1 is the kind of more self-declared devices, other than we do certify class 1 sterile devices. And the only thing we look at is it sterile? We don't actually look at, does the device do what it's supposed to do? It's just, is it sterile? For class 2A devices, that's where we look at sampling. So you can get a large number of devices on the market with more of a sampling scheme because they're not as risky. When you get into the class 2B and class 3 devices, they start to be relatively dangerous to the patient. That's where we look at them on more of a product certificate and more of a heightened level of scrutiny, and also expecting a lot more clinical data to prove that the devices are safe and effective. So in Europe, the big things are, how long does the device do what it does, and what parts of the body does it touch, and does it have medicine? All of this gets very complicated, but that's kind of the basics of it. So there's essentially 3 durations. Transient use is less than 60 minutes. Short-term use is 60 minutes to 30 days. Long-term use for your implants is above 30 days. And then we essentially have kind of 4 big groups of device types. We've got non-invasive devices, invasive devices, active devices, and then special rules. And we'll talk a little bit in more detail of each of these. So there's an MDCG guidance that actually is the easiest way to determine your classification. There are rules written into the MDR itself. This guidance document takes all of those rules and makes it much more understandable by having flowcharts. And I've got several flowcharts in here. We'll just look at a few of the interesting cases as examples. But then it's usually pretty straightforward to kind of determine what your device classification is. So for devices that don't touch the patient, they're just class 1, or if they just contact the skin. Devices for channeling blood, they could be class 1 unless they're in contact with blood or bodily fluids that are put back into the patient. And then they're class 2A. So essentially that's how it works. It's class 1 unless it meets these conditions. All of these are pretty straightforward. Really, the biggest thing here is if you have a medicinal agent that could significantly increase your classification. So these are going through a body orifice, also kind of really hits classification, can bring these up, but usually they're kind of low classification devices if it's just going through a body orifice. I would say these are a little bit more interesting where they're more surgically invasive. So these are your transient use devices used actually invasively. They're generally class 2A unless they're meeting a few criteria like administering medicines could bump it up to class 2B. And when we say in like a potentially hazardous manner, that's usually like a syringe pump where if it fails, you can kill the patient, which is a pretty bad outcome. So we want to look at those a little bit more stringently. If it's just a syringe where the doctor is using it, we wouldn't say that that's in a hazardous manner. If it's applying ionizing radiation, of course, we'll look at it more. If it actually touches the heart or the central circulatory system, that's where it really jumps up to class 3. Or if it's monitoring a condition of the circulatory system through direct contact. So really the circulatory system's the big one here to look out for. And we do have devices that kind of incidentally pass through the central circulatory system on their way to where they're supposed to be. That can something to look out for. And then looking at long term, so these are your implants. There's quite a bit more areas where you can get into high classification. So, of course, your direct contact with the circulatory system is still there. We have a lot of devices that are actually absorbed. Those would put it into a class 3 area. Breast implants, class 3 because of the scandals. Also, your disc replacements or your joints, those are going to be class 3. But really pretty straightforward rules in terms of your implants. It's either pretty low risk or it's pretty high risk. These are usually pretty binary. Any questions so far?
You may get to it, but I'm curious about how the MDR handles combination, what would be considered by the FDA a combination product, where you might have a device with either a biologic or a drug.
Yeah. That's actually under the special rules, which is in 2 slides. And I'll talk about that very specifically.
One more question on the last one, just because looking at combination of these intended to undergo a chemical change in the body, and then there's the exception for screws, wedges, plates. What about like a biodegradable screw?
If it's wholly biodegradable, that would be class 3 because it would fall under biologic effect or wholly mainly absorbed.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, it's really the highest classification you find is what it is. Yeah. So we see a lot of devices, especially in vascular, where we'll have like a coronary stent that'll be packaged with a syringe. The syringe takes on the highest classification. So it's a class 3 syringe, essentially, even though it's a 2A device in itself. So you just look at what's the highest classification, and that's what it gets to. But yeah, good question. Yeah, and the question of is it wholly or mainly is also can be a little bit of a vague description. So is that 51%? Is it 25%? There is a borderline classification manual as well. And then active devices. This is not my area, but we have people who focus. We have an entire team that focuses on active devices. So really, we're looking at is the storage of energy and deploying it into the patient increasing the risk, and that's kind of driving the classification. So kind of examples that are in here, if they're intended to monitor vital parameters from the patient, that could put the patient in danger. That would increase it to class 2B. There's also one in here for acute. It's controlling, monitoring, or directly influencing performance of active implantable devices. So that's something where a pacemaker could instantly kill a patient. It's going to be a class 3 device, or an active device to monitor stroke victims. That's something that is really putting the patient's life in danger, so it'd be a class 3 device. And then software, we have also a group of software experts because these also get very tricky to classify. And the other thing to really consider, if you have an in vitro diagnostic device and you have software, definitely talk to someone at BSI because there are very specific rules about those 2 combinations where you could be falling under MDR and IVDR at the same time. I don't entirely understand it, but we have people who do. But software is definitely one where, what is it doing? What is it monitoring? And what is the potential risk to patient? And that's how we would start looking at the classification. And then we have our special rules, which you kind of brought up. What was the specific question again? Oh, the medicinal. Yes. Yeah.
So how does this regulatory body handle what the FDA would consider a combination product of?
Yeah. So the first thing we would look at is the medicinal substance ancillary to the device itself. So a guide wire that's coated in heparin, the heparin is there to prevent clotting, but the guide wire is the star of the show. It's not the other way around. So if it's a medicinal product that also happens to have a device, I think like an injector for a medicine, there's actually a specific rule, Article 117, where if it's to deploy a medicine, we can look at just the device aspect, and then the medicines agency looks at the medicinal aspect. So we can just do like I think it's a 2-day review on the device that's deploying the medicine. But really it's, it has to be a device first, and then the medicine has to be a secondary thing.
So would it be the same, say, if you had like a heparin-coated vascular device versus sirolimus or paclitaxel-coated stent, depending on what the effect of the medicine is?
Yeah, well, the stent is really the primary thing. The heparin coating or the paclitaxel is really there to treat and help the stent do what it needs to do. It's not the other way around. Probably like so if you did an implant that was really resorbing and deploying a medicine, that's where it would probably go the other way, where the implant is just there to release the medicine. It's probably not a medical device. It's probably a medicine at that point.
I'm assuming you'd probably still have to satisfy both arms.
Yeah, and that's where we have the Article 117 route, where we're just looking at the device that deploys the medicine. So like a nebulizer, we might look at the nebulizer itself, and then the medicine that goes in that nebulizer we would look at.
We do have a quick question from the chat. So Josh asks, so a dental membrane implanted under the soft tissue that wholly degrades over a period longer than 30 days would still be a class 3?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. Yeah, definitely, because I've reviewed one.
Perfect.
Yeah, it was definitely class 3, and it didn't work out for them.
Okay.
Any other questions on these special rules? The other one is really that we get into a lot of is stuff that is using animal product, gets into class 3, bovine especially, because of the risk of mad cow. And we have a team that just does the medicinal and biologics reviews. And actually, one of our reviewers lives in Memphis. He's one of the principal reviewers, so he's a good resource. And then in this guidance document, there are specific tables that give examples, which is really helpful to be able to interpret what they're actually trying to describe in the flowcharts. A lot of times the tables can be easier to understand than the flowcharts themselves. So definitely a good resource. And then IVDR rules, I don't really understand other than at a very superficial level, but we have an entire group that works on these. The big thing is it in a professional lab setting, or is the patient using the device? And then you're also looking at highest risk is for blood screening, diseases, and then your classifications are going down as you're getting, essentially less risky. So with class D being the highest risk.
I have a broad question.
Yeah.
Again, just because I'm more familiar, of course, with FDA and what those things look like. What do timelines look like?
It's a very kind of timely question for regulatory bodies in Europe right now. There's a new annex coming out to what we have to meet that's saying that our reviews need to be done in 90 days. Traditionally, our reviews are 6 months to 9 months.
It's a big shift.
Yeah, it is a big shift. We have an interactive review service where it's more like an on-site, but we're doing it virtually, where we can ask questions back and forth to the manufacturer. we get those done in roughly 90 days if we have a good file. It's going to be really difficult for all the other notified bodies to hit that 90-day timeline because they haven't been essentially preparing for this for years. But we definitely have reviews that stretch out into the years if the manufacturers aren't really prepared. So it's going to be pretty disruptive, I think, for a lot of notified bodies and a lot of manufacturers, especially if we're like whipping really tight timelines and, where's your evidence? And you don't have it, okay, we're going to give you a nonconformity. We don't really want to go down that route, but that's kind of where it's going. They're really trying to get us to tighter timelines. Any questions on IVD classifications that I can not answer? Yeah, and then just kind of a summary of classifications. It's, defining what your intended purpose is, confirming it's a medical device, considering the definitions, and then, applying the rules to the device itself. We do have a lot of questions from manufacturers on this. We offer a structured dialogue service where we can talk through the classification with you. We're not allowed to consult as a notified body, but we can essentially ask how you're applying these rules, and we can tell you our interpretation of the regulation. So definitely, if you have questions on classification or anything, you can come to us. The worst we can say is we can't say. And then we do have a few webinars coming up that might be of interest. There's a new breakthrough devices pathway in the EU. BSI is very committed to supporting this. I'm actually the document author for, our procedure for reviewing breakthrough devices. There are some nice advantages in that you can potentially get onto the market with less clinical data, and we would expect you to collect clinical data post-certification, and we would look at that very closely, but you could potentially get life-saving devices on the market sooner through this pathway. So we'll be talking about that. And then we have structured dialogue. So how you would engage with the notified body to, ask some of these questions and kind of confirm your regulatory strategy. And then, really the third webinar is when you're actually in the review, how you can get the most out of the review and make it as painless as possible. So that one might be for startups a little further off, but I think the first two are maybe interesting sooner. And that's all I have. Any questions?
We can take questions in here. Just because I know there's a couple of others that
Yeah.
later. Can you just put the first that upcoming? No, the
yours?
slide. Yep. Yeah. Just so people are aware of it. Thank you.
Yeah.
What about processes? How are there any significant process differences engaging with some of these other regulatory bodies over what we're all more familiar with?
Versus like the FDA? Yeah, I think the difference between the FDA and a notified body is the FDA can tell you what to do. We can more tell you our interpretation of the regulation. Because we're not allowed to consult and we're not a government body. So you get more specific feedback from the FDA than you can get from a notified body. You can go directly to the essentially government in Europe and get that more direct feedback, and then we would consider it. But it's a little bit more convoluted in Europe, unfortunately. And there's good reasons for it, but it's a little bit of a difference in strategy. The other difference is, we work for the manufacturers. So, our reviews don't guarantee that you'll get certified. We're not going to certify unsafe devices, but we're looking for evidence of conformity. We're not looking for, nitpicky problems. Where, FDA might look at finding nonconformities to show that they've done a good review. So maybe a little bit of a difference in approach. Any other questions?
Amber, I know you just joined, but Jason did do a walkthrough of some of the different classifications from the MDR. I don't know if you want to get any feedback on your product or not for your. I don't know if you guys are looking at region or not, or even considering it yet.
Yesterday, somebody from Argentina came up to me and was talking about their regulatory efficiency. And so I'm not sure if this kind of covered any of that, but like maybe if you give me just a quick summary.
Yeah, I don't actually know if a CE mark is recognized in Argentina. It is actually recognized in a lot of regions outside of Europe, but I don't know about that one specifically.
I made it sound like human testing was quite easy over there.
No.
Isn't that your takeaway from her statement?
Yeah.
Oh, in Argentina or in
Yeah. Argentina.
that I don't know.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Yeah, and we actually don't cover any of the approvals for clinical studies. That you would go more to the European governments to get approval for that.
So this was more about the approval or
Yeah, this is actually getting certified in Europe. Yeah.
marketing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions right now, I'm sure we'll some will percolate. But for those that are here in person, we'll be having our beer and biotech networking where we can kind of continue the conversation. That's going to be at RP Tracks, which is nearby, I believe. For those that were able to join virtually, thank you for hopping on and connecting from wherever you are sitting today. And just as a reminder, our next session, which will be several NIH representatives on July 21st, we'll be hosting that in Nashville for that one. It's a makeup from our fall session that unfortunately was canceled, but please join us there for that. And with that,
It's my old boss.
thank you, Jason, for giving us some insights today.